Abner Hubbard. He served in the Revolutionary War, and after the war he settled in Jefferson County in Upper New York. He ran a tavern on what is now called Millen's Bay. When the War of 1812 broke out, at the age of 53, and without any orders from the military, took it upon himself to attack a fort on Carlton Island. There are several versions of the story. One is that he rode out with a neighbor and a young man, possibly his 25-year-old son, Stephen. One version is that it was several neighbors and a small boy. Abner and his crew were able to capture the fort without a gunshot. Although the fort was strategic in the American Revolution, the fort had fallen in disrepair. There are several versions of the capture. One is that they found 2 old sickly soldiers and 2 women. Some versions have the women as being ladies of the evening. Other versions have Abner and his comrades capturing several soldiers who were simply napping. Abner burned down the fort. There are only remnants there today. And he took the prisoners to Sackett Bay. The British never returned to the island, and the boundary of Canada now skirts to the north of Carlton Island. The fact that there must have been several discussions about the incident, many of them taking place in a tavern, may be the reason for the different versions to the story. However, it can be said the first military action and the first prisoners of war of the War of 1812 was not a military action at all. It was the covert action of Abner Hubbard. One of the fun things with climbing family trees is finding out where did people live and work. Are the buildings still standing? How much have they changed? In 2004, before I had ever used a GPS system, I was mapping out some family homes when I came to Edison Root and family. They were at 508 James Avenue North in 1895. So I went for a drive to find it. I got an odd feeling when I started seeing familiar streets. I came up to a school I was working at the time named West Central Academy, which was adjacent to Harrison Park. 508 James Avenue North was in the now playground of Harrison Park, a stone's throw from where I had been working. Here's Alicia Root standing where 508 would have been. The beige-colored building in the background is West Central Academy. Who would have known? This is Stella Marie Antoinette Hébert Root Anderson. And yes, that's a mouthful, so let's break it down. Stella was her first name. It is Latin for star. Marie, which was actually listed first on the baptism page, is for the Holy Mother Mary. The majority of French-Canadian Catholics use the name Marie for females and Joseph for males. Antoinette was her middle name, and Hébert was her surname that she got from her father, Telesphore Hébert. Root was the surname she took from her first husband, Earl Root, and Anderson was the surname she took from her second husband after she was widowed. Stella was my grandmother. Stella was born in 1888 and died in 1965. I was 10 years old. I had a memory for the longest time that no one else in my family could remember. In 1965, as my family was going to sell us keepsakes after her death, I came across a newspaper account and my parents were actively discussing it. Not knowing what they were talking about, I asked what it was all about. My mother told me that my grandmother had been in a very famous trial. I don't know if it was my being 10 years old and my connotation of the words famous trial, or something else my mother had said, but for the next 50 years or so, I remembered something about Grandma and a murder trial. After getting involved with my family tree, I started asking. No one, brothers, cousins, aunts, could remember anything about a murder trial. My mother and father had passed, and with all the variables, I was hitting a brick wall. But in 2018, I had a breakthrough. I found a Minneapolis Star newspaper with an article that had the answers. There was no murder trial. My grandmother had been selected for a jury in the 1940 trial of Charles Grunwald, second in command of the Minneapolis Police Force Vice Squad. Stella was chosen for the third trial of Grunwald. A grand jury trial had indicted him. A second trial focused on the allegations, but politics, shenanigans, and theatrics prevented a conviction, hence the third trial. Believe it or not, the newspaper listed the names and addresses of the jury members. This trial had headlines practically every day from January to June of 1940. The salacious trial was full of good old-fashioned accusations of corruption, prostitution, gambling, and liquor sold after hours. Grunwald was accused of taking illegal payments and protecting a house of ill repute. At one point, the mayor was dragged into the fracas, and a star witness was a madam nicknamed Frenchie, who at one point was reported as mentally deranged. Grunwald was convicted of a lesser charge, willful neglect of duty, and he eventually went to the workhouse after a few months of considering appeals. My grandmother, after all the public attention, went back to life of relative peace and quiet. And I think back and wonder if, at the age of 10, I would have understood the whole sordid affair. Well, at least it wasn't a murder. Have you ever had a gun pointed at you? I have. Once from a criminal, and once from a police officer who started to arrest me for stealing my own car. But that's another story. In April of 1963, my mother was working the counter when an armed man robbed her. 7 weeks later, after sobering up and fighting with his conscience, he turned himself in. 2 days later, he waived a hearing and most likely did some time in the workhouse. I always find it odd that the police detective gave the robber's gun to my mother as some kind of restitution for the lost money. At the age of 68, Nathaniel Root applied for a war pension and stated that his brother-in-law, more likely his cousin, Samuel Root, had been serving in 1782 under Captain Adam Granger, and after he was stationed at Horse Neck Landing, West Greenwich, Connecticut, he was struck and lame with a fever. Nathaniel's dad arranged for his nephew Samuel to be taken to a hospital. He also arranged for his son, 15-year-old Nathaniel, to serve in substitution for Samuel. Nathaniel then served 7 months until Samuel returned to the army. It's a little-known fact that 80% of marriages in history have been between second cousins. How gross! Theories exist until they are disproven, and this one has been around since 2014. Let's start with a question. Is it possible to fit your family tree on a piece of paper? This is a descendant chart, which means it starts with someone in the past and shows their children, and their children, and their children's children, etc., etc. This is roughly half a chart and one individual from 1849. So it would take a lot of Scotch tape and paper to go forward in descendancy for an entire tree. And conversely, it is very difficult going backwards in an ancestral chart. But there is not an infinite number of grandparents and great-grandparents. The ancestral chart gets bigger and bigger until it collapses. This is called pedigree collapse. So I didn't prove or disprove the cousin theory, but I'll throw one more out there. Labor Day 1943. The U.S., along with Allied forces, were invading Italy and battling German U-boats in the Atlantic. And Frederick William Blazer, Fred, was working on the Sunday of the long weekend. Fred was working for the Glenn Martin Aircraft Company. He was one of 50,000 employees during World War II. Martin manufactured aircrafts as well as housing developments for employees, military families, and civilians. Fred Blazer was the son of Frederick Patrick Blazer, who was a fireman in New York. Blazer? Fireman? There's a joke in there somewhere. Frederick was a fireman for 40 years. Frederick was married to Evangeline Hébert Blazer, a.k.a. Ava Blazer. She was born in 1885, daughter of Médérice Saint-Hilaire and Telesphore Hébert, in the French neighborhood of Minneapolis. Ava was a milliner, a maker of hats for two sisters named Anna and Mary, who ran a business called the Mrs. Harrington that served Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's possible that the successor to the Mrs. Harrington, which was Miller's Millinery, brought Ava to New York, where she met and married Frederick Blazer, Sr. September was Frederick's birthday month, as well as for his sister Mary Elizabeth. Fred was working his last shift on a runway observation tower near Baltimore, Maryland. He was scheduled to work in the plant the following week. In 1943, airport towers were not as sophisticated as they are today, and this tower was built on top of a 2-story administration building. Fred's wife, Anna Lee, as the night shift ended, was descending on the steps with Fred. Fred was holding a flashlight to light the way when suddenly he fell 35 feet to his death. Just a few hours earlier and 355 miles away, Fred's mother, Eva, died in her sleep. Fred's wife, Anna, never remarried. Henry Ransom Root was the son of Chloe Luce and Nathaniel Root, Jr. Henry married Susan Hubbard in 1860. He was a varnisher, day laborer, a teamster, and he had spent 4 months in the Union Army during the Civil War. He also had 6 daughters and 1 son from 1860 to 1871. Firstborn daughter, Clara Root, married a farmer named Wilson Albert Pottinger in 1878. 20 months into the marriage, she contracted peritonitis and died in 1880. 2 years later, Wilson, who liked to be called W.A., married Clara's younger sister, Eliza Root. Eliza gave Wilson 2 sons and 1 daughter. Eliza lived to age 65 and died of an inflammation of the kidneys in 1924. 6 years later, Wilson married the 3rd daughter of Henry and Susan Root, Abigail Root. Wilson died 2 years later in 1932. Abigail died in 1950. Wilson A. Pottinger had married 3 sisters Root. He's buried with 2 of them in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, and Abigail is buried in Madison, Wisconsin. Age is just a number, or Meadow Rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Death certificates are often filled out by a grieving survivor. Poor spelling and lack of schooling beyond primary grades account for discrepancies, and census takers did not ask for proof of age. Census takers had variables such as education, ability to spell, and to hear and sort through different accents. The last variable is whether the informer knew or cared about his or her birthday. Unless you were famous, for the most part, birthdays were not celebrated until the late 19th century and early 20th century. Federal censuses are every 10 years. The first census was 1790 and the latest was 2020. In 1850, the census started listing all inhabitants of the household and not just the head of household. In 1890, most of the records have been lost due to a fire. Data and records that are available to the public are 1790 to 1950. Minnesota censuses were taken every 10 years in between the national census on years that ended with 5. The last Minnesota census was taken in 1905. Let's take a look at one Patrick Powell, who was born in Ireland. Here's the information that was gathered about him, and we'll celebrate his birth year. I should say birth years in plural. Here's the biggest surprise. In 1860, Patrick was listed in the census as 30 years old. 3 years later, for the Civil War draft, he had gained 8 years and was suddenly 38 years old. We know the month is March, we're just not sure on the year. Happy birthday, Patrick. Let's move on to spelling with Madrice Saint-Hilaire Hébert. Quite a variation here, which includes directory listings. Medora might be my favorite. Census figures, draft registrations, and death certificates are the usual source for date of birth. I have seen some gravestones misspelled and not matching with acceptable dates. Don't panic. In Meandering Roots, Part 2, The Irish, I described several train deaths that beset the Powell family of Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Waverly, Minnesota. In the span of 23 years, 7 Powell family members died working or traveling on the railroad. Statistically speaking, I'm not sure how close this is to being the norm for the late 19th century and early 20th century, but railroad work was extremely dangerous. In 1900, about 1 in 399 railroad workers died on the job, and 1 in 28 were injured. Edison Wording Root was not a Powell, but he married a Powell, Margaret, a.k.a. Maggie. Edison died of natural causes. He was 67, but he literally died by the railroad. He had worked over 40 years as a night operator, telegraph operator, yardmaster, and switchman. In 1929, 2 years after his wife died from an auto accident, he went for a walk, and a pretty good one, I might add. He died 3 miles away from his home. He'd been walking by the Cedar Lake Railroad yards when he died of natural causes, possibly a heart attack. You've probably heard of the parlor game 6 Degrees to Better Bacon. 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where actors are linked to Kevin Bacon within 6 links or less. Let's play another game. Let's start with your past relatives. Either they are your mother, father, a grandfather, a grandmother, or a cousin. If you meet somebody and somewhere down the line you share a grandparent, then you are cousins. If it's way, way back there, then you might be a 10th cousin or higher. And if a cousin has a child, then that person is a cousin once removed, etc., etc. It also means you share some DNA with all of these people. The more DNA, the closer the relationship. And remember, you share some DNA with mice, cats, dogs, and chimps. Connections are different than cousins. They include in-laws, people who are married to somebody who has some of your DNA. In the family tree game, there can be up to 25 or more connections or degrees between people. Cousins and connections are nothing to brag about or get snooty, but they can be fun. I hope you've enjoyed Meandering Roots.
Tweet, 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 tweet.